Okay, we are live on YouTube, confirming that. So let's start. It is 9 on the dot. So a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us wherever you are. Either you are following on Zoom, on the OSA website, or directly on YouTube Live. This is the second youth stage of the Africa Dialogue Series 2024. And today we are focusing on the theme Transforming Education in Africa by Leveraging Innovative Finance and the Digital Revolution. My name is Rado Ratuvanarivo, and I am a Senior Program Management Officer at the United Nations Office of the Special Advisor on Africa in New York. I'm very happy to co-host this Zoom with my colleague Lebo Disway, who is a public information officer also here in OSA in New York. And before I introduce our exchange today, and we have a phenomenal lineup of participants, I wanted to quickly highlight one important fact, and that is for the next 20 years or so, Africa is poised to be the youngest continent in the world. And in fact, according to a fact sheet that OSA published last month, which you can check out on our website, by 2050, the number of young Africans in the 15 to 34 age bracket is expected to increase by 73%. This is huge. And for the rest of the world, for example, in comparison, this growth is only going to be 6%. I'm saying this because this space, this youth stage is for you, young Africans. And we're very happy to have you here, share your ideas, your experiences with us. And wherever you are as you're joining us today, you can too. So feel free to type your suggestions and input in the chat in Zoom or directly on YouTube Live. Or if you would like, you can also raise your hand when we reach the Q&A section, and we will be very happy to give you the floor. To help us set the stage today, it's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome Mr. Jean-Paul Adam, who is our Director of Policy Monitoring and Advocacy, and he is also the Deputy to the Special Advisor on Africa. Jean-Paul, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Rado. Thank you so much, Rado. And good morning to everyone from New York, and good afternoon and good evening to everyone who's following our discussions from the continent and elsewhere. And it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to once again engage with young people on critical issues for the acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in the context of the African Union's theme of the year, which is education. And as you all are aware, we are featuring these youth platforms as part of the Africa Dialogue series, which is under the theme of education through science, technology, and innovation toward the Africa we want. And for this week, we are particularly looking at the theme of transforming education in Africa by leveraging innovative finance and the digital revolution. I will start by firstly outlining how African countries are currently unable to invest sufficiently in education, even though education is one of the fastest multipliers of economic growth. It's estimated that an additional year of schooling increases earnings by 10% per year, while an increase of just 1% in learning is associated with a change of 7.2% in annual growth. So education is one of the best investments that can be made, not just for the sake of improving the lives of citizens, but as an economic multiplier, as one of the fastest ways that we can actually empower African countries to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and deliver results for their citizens. Investing in quality education can allow us to really address many of the gaps that are currently leading to poverty, which are leading to the continuation of food insecurity. And ultimately, investing in education is also a means of reducing the risk of conflict. And it is well documented that where education systems are more effective, the likelihood of conflict and violence breaking out is much lower. In the context of innovative financing, we must, however, always consider that even if we are looking for innovations, we must ground it in the capacity of countries to mobilize their own resources. We should recognize that already the majority of African countries are actually financing their education systems themselves to the majority. But declining official development assistance is one of the biggest risks towards the future investment in education. What we're also seeing is a trend where there is an increased overall investment in education. The total amounts of money being invested in education is growing. And this is partly driven by governments themselves, but also increased investment from the private sector and also from citizens themselves who are willing to spend more towards education. But where we can see warning signs are that as a percentage of their budgets, African countries are dedicating less of their annual budgets towards education. And this is partly driven by, for example, the increased cost of debt financing, which has dramatically increased in recent years following the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are seeing overall that there is an exodus of financial resources away from the continent, estimated to be around 500 to 600 billion US dollars per year. And this is a mix of, for example, debt servicing costs, but also illicit financial flows, unrealized gains, for example, from taxation, where ineffective taxation policies lead to loss of resources, and also resources that potentially could be invested in the continent, but for risk issues are invested elsewhere, such as the funds coming from pension funds within the continent that are often extracted from the continent because the continent is seen as a risky investment. So one of the key elements when we're thinking about innovation in terms of financing for education should be how we can use that innovation to ground financing within domestic processes and have the security in the future to know where resources will come from for investment in education. And this means creating a virtuous circle, recognizing that education itself is one of the biggest drivers of growth, and thereby dedicating reliable and predictable resources to the education sector will allow one of the best ways to grow our economies across the continent. I would like to just briefly mention that in the case of Seychelles, which is the country that I'm from, we had taken this path just after independence, where there was a big effort made towards providing access to universal and free access to education. And it has been one of the biggest multiplier effects in terms of addressing the economic needs of the country. In terms of innovative financing, there are options that are emerging. There are questions around, for example, social impact bonds, which have shown to be very effective, particularly in terms of tackling the inequities and also improving the gender gap, recognizing that women and girls are particularly affected across the continent in terms of access to education. We've also been looking at issues such as debt swaps that could allow transforming some of Africa's existing debt into investments in education, where countries would make a commitment to invest in the education sector in return for a portion of their debt to be either restructured or cancelled. And these are all options which can allow for some immediate resources to be mobilized. But we should look at it, as I already mentioned, in the context of developing domestic resource mobilization that allows long-term investment. So in some cases, we may wish to use some of the proceeds of innovative finance to create endowments for education, to create long-term financing. But the best aspect is leading towards the reinforcement of domestic resource mobilization systems. And this can lead us to also then discuss the point about science, technology, and innovation and the role of digital transformation in the transformation of the education landscape across the continent. So firstly, in terms of digital transformation, using digital tools can improve the efficiency of taxation across the continent and the means by which taxation is effectively spent. So it's not just about raising new money, it's also about ensuring that the existing money that is available is properly spent and brings the most return on investment. And this is particularly important on education, where sometimes countries may be spending on education, but not necessarily gaining as much value or rapid improvement as would be wished. And some of the things that really can be accelerators are addressing the gender gap, ensuring that all all citizens, boys and girls, have equal access to education is one of the great mobilizers and accelerators for development across the continent. Similarly, looking at digital transformation strategies, it allows education to be done differently. Education is more globalized by the fact that information is more globalized and available in different forms than it was in the past. It is both a challenge and opportunity. It is a challenge, particularly in the African context, because of the lack of access to appropriate infrastructure, and in some cases, also access to energy, which is a prerequisite for developing these aspects. But with the right targeted investment, the right targeted support, including partnerships with the private sector and including partnerships with, for example, telecom organizations, we can rapidly increase the availability of education also through digital means, and also using digital tools within existing educational institutions as a means of improving the effectiveness of education, and very importantly, aligning the needs of skills with the needs of the workforce and a changing global economic environment. The way in which African countries will create wealth is fundamentally changing. We have to be moving beyond an extractive resource for export model towards a value addition model. And digital technologies can help us do this. It can help us do this by moving more towards a knowledge economy where, for example, the ability of African startups to leverage innovative processes, to be able to trade effectively using the internet, using digital means, and being able to also leverage their knowledge products, use intellectual property, as a means of also generating additional value for African-based initiatives and companies. These are all aspects that can contribute towards the digital transformation that we want to see across the continent. At the heart of the type of transformation that we need to see, there has to be we have to be able to put people at the center of this transformation. We have to make sure that it is a citizen-led digital transformation. And these are the principles that are inherent within the African Digital Compact, and we hope will also be reflected within the Global Digital Compact to be adopted at the Summit for the Future in September of this year. And I will conclude by reminding everyone that the Summit for the Future will also include a compact for future generations. So the decisions that are being debated today, the investment that is being made in education today has a huge bearing on the future of not only our continent, but of the world, because we have this demographic dividend, potential demographic dividend. We have the largest group of young people in the world emerging. This means that Africa will shape the future. It's not even a question of if. Africa will be leading this conversation. And young people have a very important message as part of that conversation. We want to make sure that that message is based on realistic actions that need to be taken now, and particularly which empower young people now to be able to make the most of the opportunities that are there, and that these opportunities themselves also become accelerators and multipliers for future generations. Thank you so much for allowing me once again to join what is usually a very stimulating conversation, and I look forward to hearing some of the key messages that will come out and which we will, as OSA, make sure that we are transmitting across the UN system. Thank you very much, and merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much. And in fact, from those very inspiring words and the intervention that you have shared. It connects with what the special advisor on Africa mentioned yesterday when she participated in the international webinar with other principals. And she said that um, to discuss innovative finance into education, there is something in the middle that is critical from an African standpoint, and it is, I quote, to fix the education. She said education in Africa needs to be fixed so that innovative financing generates the expected rates of return. And these are words from the special advisor on Africa. Without further ado, and I know time is of the essence and we have a great engagement scheduled today, um, allow me to introduce our co-hosts for the day. Before I do, I once again would like to remind our audience, wherever you are, that you can join the exchange either by sending chats, by raising your hand, or also connecting with us on YouTube Live. And I would like to acknowledge the inputs that Hussein Mahdi, who is the executive director of the Somali Youth Volunteers Association, as well as that of Cambo Martial, who is the general coordinator of Pan African Think Do, African Network of Young Researchers, in the chat. Thank you for connecting with us today. And on that note, over to our co-hosts. We have Miss Rania Harara. She's the founder of Sawana Climate Sirens. She's a gender equality advocate and a climate expert. And she's joined today by Mr. Arnold Quizera, who is an ecosystem manager with Norskin East Africa. Arnold, Rania, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation and thank you so much for the introduction. Arnold and I are very excited to be moderating this discussion. Why don't we just move ahead and start up with the discussion? So Arnaud, would you like to start by giving your words first?
Sure thing, Rania. Thank you as well for the introduction. I think we've had Mr. Jean-Paul Adam set the pace for us for what this conversation should be able to tackle. Just to remind our audience that the conversation today is the second of the youth stages, and today we're looking at transforming education in Africa by leveraging innovative finance and the digital revolution. Again, thank you, Mr. Rado, for the welcoming remarks and setting the pace for us. But before we get into the first question, which my co-host Rania is going to lead us with, I'd like to introduce our panel of experts that are going to help us break this down, starting with Mrs. Cynthia Nafula Nyongesa, who is the advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Thank you for making the time, Miss Cynthia. Also on this panel is Miss Ariel Kitio Tsamo, the founder and director of Kesti and Tech Women Factory out of Yaoundé, Cameroon. Thank you for making the time. We're also joined by Mrs. Temilade Salami, the founder and executive director of Eco Champions. And last but not least, Mr. Bora Kamwanya, the Vice President, Diaspora Region for the Pan-African Youth Union. Thank you very much for making the time. So over to you, Rania, for the questions to
Thank you
our
so
panel.
much. Thank you so much and welcome to our panelists. Why don't we start with Mr. Bora about our first question related to innovative finance for education in Africa, as we know that in order to advanced educations and education systems, and even education in all of its form, we need to invest and put the money in education for our continent. And I was wondering how can innovative finance mechanisms such as impact investing and social impact bonds be tailored to specifically address the challenges that our education initiatives face in Africa, especially those that target women, young women, and youth.
Thank you very much, Rania. It's a pleasure to be in here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for thinking of the Pan-African Union. So I think the first thing we need to think about here is who are we investing for when we're investing in education? More often, and I'll take an example from DRC, the schools that are most invested in are private schools, and the states will actually be more keen to invest in private schools. So is it that there's no funding, or there's just not funding for public schools? So the fundings are there. We're seeing a lot of fundings for the private schools, but not enough for the public schools. In DRC, there is a program for 145 villages and territories where the state is investing more than 2 million USD into building schools in different provinces. We have 26 provinces. But that would not be enough for a population of 100 million people. And we've heard before that for the next 20 years, youngest population. Can you hear me, Rania?
Yes, you lagged for a second, but I think we can hear you. You're back with us.
Oh, amazing, amazing. So sorry about that. Sorry about that. Yes. So we have an issue. We have an issue with fundings, and I do not believe for many African lack of interest into funding education. I believe it's as was said earlier, an issue with high interest on the bonds. And if you want to focus on social impact bond, if you want to focus on social impact bond, this would perhaps be the solution for the short term. But Africa needs to be sovereign in terms of education. African countries needs to be sovereign in terms of education. If we do not educate our population, they'll go to the US, they'll go to Europe, they'll go to Asia, and most of the time when they go, they don't come back. And this is when we're talking about losing all the talents of Africa. So if we want to focus only on women or on boys, and you can see this actually, you have schools focusing only on girls, schools focusing only on boys. I would understand the reason behind it. If you were to tell me that you are in a country or on a continent where education is accessible. But once you don't have that, I think it's very important to just focus on quality education. We need to have good curriculum that actually represent our society today. We need to have curriculum that represents the markets on the continent. We need to have curriculum that represents the aspiration, the 2063 agenda. Until we do that, until we have a scheme that allows African countries, let's not even talk about the continent as a whole, but African countries individually, focusing and investing in a bold way in the education. For example, in DRC now, I think it's 1.6 million that is invested, no, billion, sorry, 1.6 billion that is invested, which is not enough. The GPE, the Global Partnership for Education, is asking that each government should be investing 6 to 8% of its own budget, not just the GDP, but of the own budget, and that's the most important in order to ensure that young people have access to school. Young people have access to quality education, because again, here we're talking about education, but it's very important to focus on quality education, and also that our countries do not put themselves in debt indefinitely, a debt that will be replicated on those young people that we're preparing for the Africa of tomorrow, the Africa that we want. I hope you're able to catch all of that. Felt like my reception was a bit bad.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bora, for your insights and sharing the DRC example with us. I was curious if Mrs. Cynthia, Ariel, and Mrs. Salami can tell us more about other successful or projects and examples of innovative financing models in education that are set in their communities, and how can we follow up on those models, change them, rectify them, and replicate them even in other contexts within the African continent?
Thank you, Rania. I'm not sure if the question is directed to me, but I'll just...
It's directed to everyone. I want everyone to be able to share their insights.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Bora, for your insights. I think that was very interesting. It's always amazing to learn what the continent is up to. Just to focus on the question of how to tailor the social impact bonds as well as impact investments to the needs of women and young people, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, what is it that women and young people want? What is it that they want to achieve? My age group is saying, we want money, we want jobs. At the end of the day, after we are educated, we want to be able to provide for our families. Our parents are retiring, we are getting children. How is it that we're going to sustain ourselves? And as Bora had mentioned, there is that challenge where a lot of young people are moving away from the continent to seek education elsewhere. So I would say one way of tailoring these mechanisms to what young people need and women is to have community engagement and empowerment. I think that's very important, to have a discussion with these women and young people and ask them, what do you think is culturally appropriate to you? What do you think is relevant? What do you think is responsive to your needs? Because the needs of a young Kenyan like me are not necessarily the same as the needs of a young person from the DRC or from Nigeria. The other way I would say would be very important is to ensure that these mechanisms are also very flexible. When you're talking about social impact bonds and impact investments, you also need to ask yourself, where will this money go into? So for example, you might find that some countries are more well equipped in terms of infrastructure, while others need more water resources. So even as you're coming up with these mechanisms, you need to ensure that they're channeled into those needs. So if you're talking about a successful example, I'm a Kenyan who's studying in South Africa in the Western Cape province at the University of Cape Town. And what I found very interesting working in terms of social impact bonds is this project called the social impact bonds that drives early childhood education targets. I know you're talking about women and young people, but we must always start with the children and young people. And what I found interesting about this example is how the public and private sector came together and they invested 540,000 US dollars specifically for early childhood education. And what was very interesting about this example was also the how the government was involved as well as the private sector, like the Standard Bank. And what I saw working very clearly in terms of the impact bonds was the fact that it was focused on outcomes. So we are asking ourselves, what results do we want to achieve? We want to see young people, children being able to read by the age of 10. We've also seen a good example from this model is the cross-sector collaboration. So at the end of the day, even if you're talking about social impact bonds, it's very important to remember that education is a public good and the responsibility eventually lies with the government. So having that cross-sector collaboration in terms of policy making as well as funding from the private sector is great. And lastly is the issue on flexibility. As I mentioned, this study went in to check what is it that the Western Cape province needs. And they said it's early childhood education. And just to see how this particular model can actually grow, is to ensure that we have shared goals and objectives. If you're talking about a Western Cape province or Kenya, for example, do we have shared goals and objectives? That's the first thing. The other thing is to make sure that these roles are clearly assigned. If you're looking at this particular social impact bond, you see that the role of the government was in policy making, and then the role of the private sector was in investing the money. And then the other model that worked in terms of this impact bond is the risk sharing and mitigation. So who takes the risk? Because private sector is not just going to give money when they don't know how that risk is going to be shared. And the other important thing is to ensure that it's innovative and it's also efficient. The best way to do that is to ensure that there's, of course, proper accountability mechanisms, proper follow-up on how this money is being used, and also to ask ourselves, are we going to do this project in 3 years? So for example, this project was done in 3 years, and after that it was measured and evaluated, and they decided, okay, we're going to replicate this to other provinces in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. And Cynthia, you set the pace for us there. You bring the role that the private sector should be or could be playing, and it becomes a kind of a carrot and stick kind situation there. And here we look at things like what role edutech could play.
Cynthia, for your insights. Arnaud, I think you're back with
Yes.
us. Perfect.
Rania, sorry, I was speaking earlier. Thank you, Rania. Cynthia, once again, thank you for those insights, and you seem to set the pace well in regards to what role that the private sector could potentially play when it comes into the digitization and transformation of education on the continent, which is kind of a mixed bag when you look at the numbers, because when you look at the success of edutech players in the private sector on the continent, you hardly have, two or three, or in my world where we deal with the startups, you tend to find that the private sector, you tend to find that players in the edutech tend not to know how best to monetize it, which becomes harder for the private sector to invest in education. So I want to bring someone into the conversation who is playing a role within the private sector and trying to help the next frontier of education around STEM, which is the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Mrs. Ariel Kitiotamo, based out of Cameroon, runs what seems to be a very successful coding program and tech women factory. And the question here, Ariel, would be in regards to harnessing the digital transformation for education on the continent, how best can the African countries bridge that divide to ensure that there's both equitable access to quality education, but more so in the remote, underserved areas, while at the same time it making sense on a financial aspect for the private sector?
Thank you so much for the question. I'm very happy to be among you today, and thank you for inviting us. So I will start by saying that we have to be intentional about the kind of citizen we want to have in a country. And as Rania was saying before, education is first of all based on government. So we have to have, each country have to have a kind of national strategy of education and have a clear vision about where are we going to and which kind of citizen are we building today, because children of today are citizens of tomorrow. So we have to start at the early age. And to answer your question about harnessing digital technology for equity in rural area, I think that there is how can you say, a vocabulary problem. So generally, when we are talking about digital technology, people assume that we are talking about internet, whereas we can have hybrid technology that can be lead to rural areas. For example, we are talking about having access to educational resources. Most of the time, we are thinking that we have to have access to internet to be able to have access to those educational resources, whereas you can use some technology like nano servers that you can use locally that can serve around 5 kilometers in the village, and then everybody at home can have access to this content without having access to internet. And then you can just connect the component like once a month or once a trimester to have like, let's say, an update. That's the first point. The second point is that when you're talking about impact investing, I feel like as no one is dying right now because of lack of education, that's why maybe we are keeping saying it's not that urgent, it's not that we don't have to do it like right away. But I'm working with kids, I'm working with women, and I'm saying that the way, I will take the example of coding, for example. When a kid learns how to code, he changed his way of thinking. He's more structured. He knows he learned more about problem solving. So the way he's addressing things in the real life changed completely. That's why I'm saying choosing the technology, choosing the curriculum is also based on the national strategy of who are we building in a country. And that's where technology can really help to break the stereotype that people have in their mind by saying, I'm able to create a solution. And technology is a good equalizer, because thanks to technology, you have kids being able to create small prototypes to help, for example, a farmer. I will take an example of a young girl called Jamdudu. She's 16 years old. She created a small component for her grandmother in the village to be so that she is able to know exactly where to irrigate in her farm, for example. She's just 16. She's not a genius. She's just someone who was connected to the content and who was let's say trained. I don't know if you understand what I mean. So integrating technology at the young age of education helps us to create problem solvers. Help us to create people think that I'm not young enough, I'm not too young, I'm not too girl, I'm not too African to create a solution for my ecosystem or my community or any other thing. And in Cameroon, for example, we have what we call parent association. Parent association is kind of a kind of small funds in every school where parents contribute, and then that money is used by the school, especially in public schools. That money is used to maybe buy books for those who don't have books, buy chalks, sometimes to pay teachers who are not who don't have enough money to keep going to school. So for example, parent association is a good example of how local communities can help to support or leverage funds for their own, for the education of their own ecosystem. Yeah.
Arno, I believe your mic is closed.
Oh, thank you, Rania. Thank you for that. Cynthia, thank you for those insights. I would love to bring another panelist into the conversation. And this is Ms. Temiladi Salami, the founder executive director of Eco Champions. Have a very interesting education model. It's very intentional, it's very focused around the ESG space, around climate, climate education. And I just want to tap into your background first before you also set the pace for us. When you started out Eco Champions previously, the conversations around ESG and climate were not seen as the buzz conversations, as something cool, right? um, they were seen as maybe things of the future. Climate change is happening now and it's real, and Africa seems to bear the brunt of, and yet it has contributed the least to the climate change factors. But that means the solutions have to come locally. And those solutions have to come from people educated on what actually climate change is and how best it could be tackled. So I want you to tap into maybe your experiences thus far in the growth of Eco Champions on, is it possible to build strategies, and what kind of strategies could be employed to integrate digital literacy and skills development into something as specific as climate education? And then how best can maybe policymakers or even the private sector play a role to build the infrastructure that is needed for this kind of intentional education? Ariel, your mic is on mute.
Okay. Sorry, I was not, my internet was cut. Please, if you can just repeat the last sentence. Hello?
Sorry. Sorry, not Ariel. Sorry, Temiladi Salami. Your microphone was on mute. Temi. Sorry, Ariel. The question was to Temi. Okay, I don't think we've gotten a hold of Temi. Ariel, we'll bring you back into the conversation here, and I wanted to talk about the need for being deliberate, and this is from a policy level, right? Using Rwanda as an example, and I'll use Rwanda because that's where I'm currently based, and I've seen the purpose of what intentional policy making is. I'll give a quick example. we were in Parliament sometime last year, and we talked about the lack of a Startup Act and the Startup Law as being detrimental to attracting FDI into the country. And in a period of 1 month, the Minister of ICT had put together already a committee and players in the sector to work on some form of policy regarding a Startup Act. Now, startup laws and acts are already existing on the continent. Tunisia has the best, so we didn't need to rewrite the wheel, right? So we picked a few learnings and lessons from other African countries, and as of now, which is less than 12 months later, we have a functional Startup Act in the country, and FDI investment into the startup sector has gone up by more than 119% in less than 12 months, but that just came out of intentionality, right? So how could something like that be transferred even on a policy level into other African markets, into Central African countries, the likes of Cameroon, Chad, Central African Republic, to ensure that we have the right STEM education for the next generation?
Yeah, I think that when we are talking about the government has the stopper power, so they can actually do whatever they want. They need to do it. So, for example, I saw some example for Chad or for Israel, for example, that having taxes on money, for example, to construct schools in the local area where you're extracting that resources from. We have also tax bonds from that diaspora. So when a country is intentional, they can have incentive measure to make the diaspora to give ways to the diaspora to contribute, because whenever you are, you feel like your home, you have to contribute to your home. So we have to make policy or instrument that will help the diaspora to contribute in form of diaspora bond. We have many countries who did it, and then it's working very, very good. Another thing is the PPP, but they will say something tricky about the PPP, because generally when you're talking about PPP, we lack knowledge transfer. So it's like just like someone is coming with the knowledge, coming with the money, and then the government is giving the institutional support. And then after the 3 or 5 years of the program, we don't have any sustainable things to keep the project moving. So something very interesting is like the egg and chicken problem. So we have to work in the education to make sure we have at least few local techno-pedagogy engineers in the local. So when you come with your money, they can create the value, the knowledge at the local. So when you are going back with your money, they are still there with the knowledge. They can still continue to contribute to the advancement of the program. So I think the government can help in that point. And I will give an example. During the COVID, we saw many countries buying licenses from the GAFA, like Microsoft, Google, etc. But we also saw some other countries said, okay, we are going to open a hackathon and then put few money to have edtech startups building the national e-learning platform, for example. That's another way of boosting the ecosystem, and young people, young engineers will feel like their country are trusting them, trusting their competence, and they are going to give the best of themselves. Whereas when you are buying licenses from outside, the money is going outside. Nothing is sustainable enough to be in the country. And that leads me to another point of data sovereignty of education. For example, there are some countries who bought computers from outside who are hosting the whole content of the university in clouds, other clouds. Whereas the knowledge, information is the power, knowledge is the power. So even in education, the country has to be intentional about how is it keeping the intellectual property of the engineers, of the university students, of the doctors, etc. And then for that, we have to invest in teachers, we have to invest in protecting IP, we have to invest in, let's say, what I call techno-pedagogy, how people can connect technology to pedagogy to make sure that technology is used wisely to help having sustainable way of leveraging education with IT.
Thank you, Ariel, for your insights. I'm gonna go back again to talk about education financing because I feel like financing education is one of the best ways to advance education. And I was wondering, from all of your experience, this question is directed to all of our panelists, and I was wondering from all of your very special contacts and very special experiences, what are the primary barriers that you've been facing to and that you are aware of in your community to adequate education financing in Africa? And how can we overcome these barriers through policy intervention, but also how African governments can enhance domestic resources mobilization? I will direct firstly the question to Mrs. Cynthia, if you would like to go.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Ariel, for your insights. I think those are very interesting. When you're talking about challenges, I always go back to my deputy principal from high school, and she was very passionate, still is, about girl child education. And the other day we were having a conversation about how difficult it is to raise money, especially for the most vulnerable children. I was lucky enough to attend a national school here in Kenya where we had adequate resources. But when you compare to other schools, especially in rural areas here in Kenya, it's very difficult, majorly because they don't have access to networks, they don't have access to government resources, they don't even have roads, for example. So if you're asking yourself then, what is the main barrier to innovative financing here in Africa? I'd say the first thing, of course, is the adequacy of revenue. That's a major, major issue. When you're looking at the revenue streams in public-private partnerships and or philanthropic funding, not many organizations are willing to give their money and to invest in education. But the good thing is that even if that is a problem, we still have good models here in Kenya. For example, the most well-known is the Equity Wings to Fly program, which I happen to be a volunteer mentor. And this program, the Equity Bank has partnered with Mastercard Foundation to ensure that so many children continue to access education, particularly secondary education, as well as higher institutions of learning. I would say the other challenge to the funding models, innovative financing models, is the cost inefficiency. When you're looking at this digital transformation projects, you're saying, okay, we want to have 12 million children in school, for example, who have access to the internet, who can code by the age of 15, who can do all these great things. But then are we asking ourselves how effective our project management systems are? You find that sometimes it's also linked to skills. So you find not so many people know how to manage a project. And then now at the end of the day, even if there is money from these innovative financing models, then there's cost inefficiency because the money has not been managed properly. And then, of course, then that ties into the issue of how this funding is spent. If the previous funding had not been spent well, nobody's going to be willing to put in more money. And then the other thing we still need to keep asking ourselves is, are our projects sustainable? Even as we're looking into the year 2030, when we need to have achieved all the SDGs, when we need to have ensured that everyone is into education and lifelong learning, are our projects sustainable? That's a very, very major issue. So you may have the funding, but if the project is not sustainable, then how this money is spent then will not be used properly. And then I would say, lastly, the other issue when it comes to innovative financing models as a challenge is that there's excessive reliance on traditional sources. So we've really relied on government budgets, and our governments keep saying that we don't have enough money. For example, right now, East Africa has faced a major flood crisis. So schools have been destroyed. But then the government will say, okay, we have this capitation, but it's not enough. And if we've really relied on this government capitation and we've not explored other innovative finance models, then it's going to be very, very difficult. So I think we need to look at these challenges and ask ourselves, then how do these innovative financing mechanisms come in to assist us? Ariel had talked about diaspora bonds. We can talk about debt swaps, debt swaps in future. We can always talk about remittances, because we see that a lot of Kenyans, for example, are in the diaspora. How can their money return into the country and ensure that it's being invested into education? We can also ask ourselves that, yes, so many people are not paying their taxes. It's the truth. How can these taxes be collected to ensure that we are still investing in the digital infrastructure that our children and young people need?
Uh, Thank you, Cynthia. And Cynthia, I'm just going to stick with you there, just to try and throw a small spanner in the works. I think we want to have tangible solutions coming out of this conversation, and you note some very important questions. I want to throw something back to and use an example of what we have been able to figure out or do in Rwanda at Norskin, in regards to, okay, yes, these are the challenges as you've noted them. The challenges are the money is not there. Then we'll talk about innovative financing, that it's, how do people make their money out of it, and these are questions, right? Very honest conversations and honest questions, but then the solutions, because it's only us who are going to have these solutions at the end of the day on what can be done specifically, right? So case in the works, Rwanda, there's the West cut funding at a certain period of time into some particular sectors, and the country decides among the people itself. There's a very functional health system. 98% of the population have health insurance, and this is a third world country. But then every person has health insurance. The 2% that don't have health insurance is for religious reasons, and they're allowed not to do that, right? So Rwanda has managed to have health insurance for everyone by creating different tax systems. Every household has some form of electrification. Why? Because there is a regressive electrification system depending on which part of the country you live in. So using Kenya as an example, someone in Kari, Nairobi, doesn't pay the same amount of electricity as someone in Kisumu, right? And that's largely because when people live in different parts of the country, those in rural areas can't afford as much as those in the urban centers. So those are very practical examples. So we have a flooding situation that has happened in the three of the major capital cities in the East African Community region, in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Bujumbura, and a little bit of Kampala over the last, I would say, 15 days. So what are the practical solutions in your case that you think, if we did X, Y, Z today, that will solve or will give us a quick win for the education literacy and digitization of it?
Yeah, if you're talking about solutions, and we're still talking about financing as well as PPPs, one of the major challenges that I've been able to interact with as a young professional, visiting the fields, visiting different schools, is the lack of access to enough public education, public schools rather. So you find that so many children up to these days are walking so many kilometers to access education. That's a challenge. So then what is the solution? When I was talking to young people, there's a young person from Nigeria who mentioned how the microfinance institutions have actually stepped in to help us address these kinds of challenges, especially in terms of infrastructure. So one young person actually mentioned a microfinance institution called Opportunity Edu Finance. And this young person was saying, okay, so there are like 13 million children who are out of school. How do we ensure that they get back to school? So this microfinance institution has enabled entrepreneurs to access low-cost loans to start up their own schools. And one of the requirements for them to get these loans is that they must ensure that the schools that they build are not just buildings with desks and chalkboards and all that, but they must also have specific leaning towards digital education. So they must have computer labs, and within these institutions, they must have flexible curriculums that are designed towards equipping the learners as well as the teachers with with digital education. And this is because they've realized that, okay, this is the challenge the government is facing, and entrepreneurs also don't have enough money to start their own schools. So because of models like this, we're also seeing that institutions like this are now also getting loans to have their own teachers being trained into getting the requisite skills that they need to train their own learners. And the other important thing when you're talking about this particular model in Nigeria is the access to infrastructure and the devices. So part of the agreement is also for them to purchase the infrastructure and the devices that they need to ensure that they have this digital education going on. And the most interesting thing I think I found with this particular model when I was speaking to the young people is the aspect of community engagement and parental involvement. I think Ariel had mentioned that it's very important to also ensure that parents are involved. So in establishing this digital education in the schools, the microfinance institutions are also asking, have you talked to the parents? What are the needs of the community? Are there learners with disability? What is it that they need? And then they give this kinds of fundings. And then if you're talking about Kenya, there's also, of course, the issue of access to education and access to proper classrooms. One example that I have found that works very well in Kenya is when you're talking about the issue of scaling, because now we're asking ourselves, what are the solutions? I came across this particular initiative called DigiTrack, and DigiTrack has identified the fact that so many schools don't have access to electricity. So what they've done is they've refurbished a container, and it's been converted into a lorry, and this lorry goes into different communities to ensure that learners are actually accessing education. And they've actually partnered with Huawei, which I think is really great. And now 2,300 students so far have been able to access this digital education, whereas they would have never been able to do that because of lack of access to electricity. So if you're talking about a solution, how can this models like this DigiTrack be expanded? I think diaspora bonds really are great in this particular instance. There are so many people who go abroad and they're always saying, okay, I still want to be tied to my community. Even if I'm living in America or the UK, I want to do something great for my community. And so if you encourage the people from the diaspora to invest back here in Kenya and buy a bond, and then this bond is used by the government to invest in projects like DigiTrack, I think we're going to really overcome so many barriers. One, access to digital education, and then the issue of access to electricity. And remember, we're also talking about climate, because projects like this actually are climate friendly. Yeah.
Thank you, Cynthia, for your intervention. My next question would be directed to Ray. I was just following up on the discussion that we've been having about education financing. I was wondering what opportunities exist for international collaboration and support to supplement domestic education financing and in Africa, whether it's for infrastructure development, but also capacity building. In what ways would you also see these international organizations, these other countries that would like to partner, contribute to the education challenges in Africa? How would you see this partnership?
Thank you so much, Rania. And I really enjoyed sentiments from the rest of from my colleagues around the issues they raised, from infrastructure to financing to curriculum. And so I just want to pitch my conversation in a direction that before we can look into international collaboration, first, it's very important that each state, each country, to really align what they want to achieve in the kind of education that they really want to push. And I think one of the examples that I want to point out is important as much as we can think of it, is number one is the kind of vision that a country sets that it wants to achieve, because this really sets the kind of investment that you need, the kind of collaborators that you need to bring on the table. And just to look into that, there is enormous opportunity to attract international collaboration. But I would look at this equation as protagonists. And while I enjoyed the conversation around education financing, and at some point I had an opportunity to sit with stakeholders who are into education, and then understanding how they look education financing. So looking at education financing, it's I mean, I think most of the people would view it as, impact investment. In terms of education is important. We need to have financing into it. But then when you're looking at the education financing as an investment, there's also a composition around how they get their investment back, because most of these investments really, unless if it's the government, but then if it's the private sector, they're looking into how do they get, like reward out of it? How do they get a profit out of it? And so the question was, probably we've been, positioning the question of education financing differently. We've been looking at it as social support. But then when we're looking for the private sector to really come in, I think it's important to point out this is the issues that would happen from, in action to this kind of education. Probably looking at the kind of challenges they might face in the sector if they do not have enough skilled people. And so that would then sensitize them to really look into investing into a particular track to be sure that certain skills, certain education levels is achieved. And so that is one thing that I think I wanted to really point out. But also, secondly, is the priorities of governments in terms of what they want to achieve as part of the education investment. A good example that I think this really sympathizes with me every time is I've met so many young people that at least have an undergraduate degree on one field, but they are trying to reacquire new skills and do their work in the other field. Now, the question is, what would have happened if they had ventured, if they had invested their time, the last 3 or 4 years of the undergraduate, into that particular track? Probably now there's a question around how do we mentor or career guide? What kind of um, what kind of future does it look like for these young people? And so to go into the opportunities that are available for collaboration, number one is with the availability of technology, collaboration is reimagined. Collaboration comes in terms of content creation, curriculum renovation. And so there's a lot of opportunities around people who are experienced. We're seeing new forms of education in form of master classes. This is new ways of where people can really get mastery learning and skills. And so collaboration in terms of creating universal specialized skills and training exists. And we see those we can refer to as veterans. And so these people, probably most of them would, of course, publish a book, or some would at least maybe use multimedia and digital means to really share the knowledge and experience that they've carried over the years. And so in terms of what opportunities exist for collaboration, number one is international organizations that really focus in research and development really exist. And we're seeing both from public sector, but also private sector. The private sector that really is looking into new solutions in their industry. They're looking into new kind of skill that really will put their industry at the edge of development. So these private sector institutions would really be in position to support, supporting education that really would have a cycle effect into the kind of industry and the economy that they're trying to grow. So the private sector really is available, but then the question really comes in, are we in the conversation with the private sector in a language that they can listen to, that can really entice them to be able to come in and say, this is a component that we want to support. But also, secondly, I want to point out our countries really have to put, I remember a conversation around deliberate actions in policy, and we cannot rely on basic education. We have also to look at specialized education. Now, in specialized education, countries have to invest in research and development. And as it stands now, an average African country only spends about less than 1% of its GDP in research and development. Now, we cannot really move the paradigm if we rely and feel comfortable on basic education. And so the question on is there international collaboration available? The question is yes. Is there institutions that are ready to assist in reforming this kind of education? Because even governments, they have to raise the bar. Because by not raising the bar, it's difficult to really see the pace of progression that you're expecting from the education that you've invested on. Today, we see countries, I am from Tanzania, we see countries like Tanzania receiving support from international partners, let's say on basic equipments like classroom desks, while Tanzania really exports, millions of tons of timber as well. And so the question is it really need or is it realignment? And so what do we want these international collaborators to really play? What kind of a role? And so just to conclude, I think I just want to reiterate that there is international collaboration available, but all players have to really recognize their role. And I think our governments, both the civil society, have to be critical in terms of what role do we want to play. How can we sensitize the private sector? Because the thinking of the private sector is different from government and how it works. So we have to be in a position to really bring the conversation that resonates. And lastly, is the kind of future that we envision. Because at the end of the day, as much as we want a different understanding of aspirations and future, comes to about different, realizations, even in education, of course, realization in education policies. And so, how do we pitch our own future? Where do we want to be? And then we could start working on a reverse engineering in terms of this, the kind of the critical steps that we really need to take. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Ray, I just want us to stay with you a little bit there, and you note a very, I would say, not very optimistic picture when it comes to our R&D investment. Less than 1%, vis-a-vis compared to the countries. When you compare the Asian tigers, on average, they do about 4% of their GDP, 3 to 4% of their GDP going into research and development. We've seen what Israel has been able to do over the years with its education policies and systems. Again, going on the upper side of 4% of their GDP, intentionally going to R&D. We have an agenda as a continent, though. That's Agenda 2063, which I believe is something you are very passionate about. And Bob, please feel free to dive into this answer maybe after Ray, right? So we have Agenda 2063 where we want to work backwards as a continent, but then we are stuck in 1952 with our education systems, largely in many parts of the continent where we're not evolving as fast. There's some good examples that we can pick learnings from Uganda, how it has been able to privatize the education system there to attract, the biggest chunk of the education system being done by the private sector that benefit from it as well on a financial scale. Or you could go the Rwanda route where the country has been able to invite the top universities from across the world to set up base in the country and say, you know what, we don't have the right education systems that we agree to. What can we try? Let's try Africa Leadership University. Let's try Carnegie Mellon University. Let's try specific education across STEM in the country. Let's partner with South Korean universities to set base here, and let's have very deliberate education systems across different provinces. TVET education, which is largely coming from the Germans, also being transferred here. Those are very intentional examples, but also two different varying examples that seem to be going towards some form of direction. So as we stand currently, 2063 is not far. How do we reverse engineer? And this is a question that came in from a gentleman, from a person, known as Campbell Marshall ATSE. How can education in Africa meet the aspirations of the Africa Union's Agenda 2063?
Thank you, Arnold. Really, I think this is a very fundamental question. And just to reiterate, when looking at education and Agenda 2063, it's important to look at Africa and the young people and the children as a package. It's a bit difficult when we look at education, segmentedly, because sometimes a good example would be to have, the aspirations of the Agenda 2063. A couple of fundamentals really have to be addressed. Number one is the issue of quality and inclusive education. So these are really explicit in the Agenda 2063 itself, around issues around ensuring and having that all children, despite of their gender, location, or despite of their socioeconomic status, they have a quality education. Now, keyword quality. Now, a good example, for instance, in Tanzania, I would like to recall a bit of a path. Tanzania had, I would like to call it internationalization of education. 30 years back, we had very capable and very competitive public schools. And the reason we had these schools was because the state made a deliberate choice that we want universal education to be available to anyone, despite of their socioeconomic capabilities. And these schools were the best of the best. So only those people who were not able to be accommodated by the public schools were then able to go to private schools. But then with the internationalization of education in somewhere, in a good faith, of course, to be sure to allow more investment in education, what we saw was it really created a gap between those who can pay for the best education, can be able to go and acquire best education. But those who cannot really would depend on the available infrastructure education that is, provided by the public. So this created a bit of a clash in terms of where is the aspiration of the public intention to education itself? Because we have to see the deliberate action of the government wanting to be sure this is the direction of education. So this is one example in terms of quality. So the contradiction between universal education and quality really comes into a bit of a clash when people have different levels and statuses of socioeconomic capacities. So there's a bit of a challenge. So this is where I think we have to come back on the intent of the state and the role of a state in ensuring that the provision of quality and universal education inclusively is paramount. The second aspect in achieving Agenda 2063 is the issue of curriculum reform and skills development. And this is really critical. So questions like, how do we nurture talent? How do we nurture talent? I went to an engineering school. I am an architect by training. And in my university, we had a bit of a joke that those who would, for instance, the kind of, let's say, faculties like electrical engineering or mechanical engineering or along those lines, they'll be doing a lot of paperwork. They'll be doing something we call alternative to practical. So you have mechanical engineers that really do not have enough opportunity to practice or at least feel the engineering part of itself. So we have too much alternative to practical. This is because of lack of infrastructure in such universities and, of course, educational institutions. So the question is, curriculum reform, do we need certifications, degrees as certificates, as pieces of paper, or do we need skills? And then now, what is the deliberate action into this kind of skills? So curriculum have to be explicit in terms of what do we need to achieve and how do we achieve this? And examples are very clear. The saddest thing, which I really find a bit of a confusion, is when you look at our education policies, it's really clear that it wants the people who go into such institutions to have the best, knowledge and skills and capabilities to solve solutions. But apparently, the reality is a bit different. The other area that I think I just want to touch on is in achieving Agenda 2063, the reality around leveraging technology, which is part of the key conversation that we're having today. But looking at leveraging technology, technology cannot be looked separately. This is where we look at education separately. We have to look at it as a package. So technology needs its prerequisites for us to be able to capitalize on technology. My colleagues have mentioned the likes of infrastructure. They've mentioned the likes of technology literacy. I think the other reflection is the level of aspiration of our policymakers would reflect the kind of ambition a state or Africa at large really has. And so how do we reform curriculum to have things like, mentoring talent? How do we have talent more critical than a piece of, degree that I've been able to graduate? I remember somebody made a joke, but then when you look at it, it's really serious. Like you go to LinkedIn, it's one of the goofiest things that everyone is a founder. Everyone has a lot of these educational qualifications, but everyone is still looking for a job or some kind of opportunity. So the question is, we've created an ecosystem that values titles in a way, and not really skills. So how do we reform our education to value those who really produce? Now, these have to be part of our deliberate policies in terms of how we want our society to function. And lastly, but not least, Mr. Moderator, just also to allow my colleagues to also contribute, is the issue around teacher training and professional development. Now, I was also enlightened. There's a big difference between teachers and facilitators. Our education now is investing on teachers, and teachers teach facts. Now, the education that we need to have, it's very possible that there may be people that you are teaching, unless if it's basic education, but these people really have a level of understanding on the subject or experience that may be superior to the so-called the teacher. Now, the question is, when a person trying to teach something comes with a mentality of facilitating, the conversation is different. It comes into how do you cultivate curiosity with the people that you presumably teaching. And so the question is, teacher training and professional development have to be deliberate across each levels of age. A minor's age, they need to be taught or realigned, but the higher you go, there has to be a mechanism that is flexible to allow that it delivers for the kind of need, for the kind of reality, and really to have programs that really supports the first word kind of a teachers. I remember myself, I would not mention for the sake of it, at some point, one of our teachers had an example from one of the Google publishments, and then the students as well, we were able to go to the same, resources. And so everyone came back from that, task, and everyone got the right answer. The teacher was like, no, this is not possible. How can you be able to get the correct answer? So the first instinct was these people are cheating amongst themselves. But then if you're looking at people are cheating, instead of being, like impressed, like, wow, this, most of people really know what they're supposed to be looking for, I think there's a question to ask in terms of teacher training and facilitators that we're having in our ecosystem. And so to conclude, Mr. Moderator, looking at transforming Agenda 2063 and education, we should not look at education as a segmented component. We should look at a package. People have to come to school. They cannot come to school with empty stomachs. They may not be able to study. They cannot study in facilities that, like maybe there's a lot of disturbance. Maybe there's no, a place where they can nurture their learning. We cannot have facilitators that are worried about, their next part-time job. They have to go do some part-time job at a restaurant because, they're taking too much time in a class. We cannot have an education that really, the people that are supposed to be supporting it, governments are maybe comfortable with, we've achieved this much number of primary education enrollment. We've been able to increase this percentage of of budget into education, but then can we look at the outcomes? Can we look at the impact? What has this been able to be having an impact? I thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray, for your answer and for your insights. We'll move forward with a question from the floor by Mrs. Mutuni, directed to Bora, Mr. Bora. The question is, how can we ensure that innovative financing models for education in Africa are sustainable and equitable, particularly for vulnerable scholars? For example, in Kenya, scholars from refugee camps, Kakuma and Dadaab, do not receive the government fee capitation for the secondary school fee, even if it's a challenge in university since they cannot access higher education funds from the government or private sectors.
Thank you. Thank you, Rania. Can you hear me? All good this time?
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
can perfectly hear you.
Amazing. And thank you for the question. Think it's refugee camps are communities on their own, and there are many ways that we could definitely ensure quality education for folks in refugee camps. And the first one will be perhaps the PPP. Right, we've been talking about it since the beginning of this webinar, but it's very important to bring the private sector and to put them to put it at the center of their responsibility. This needs to be the corporate social responsibility in order to educate the population in the area that they're operating in. Not just that, but also community engagement. And of course, and I'm not really familiar with the situation of Kakuma and Dadaab in Kenya, but if we look at refugee camps in DRC, and perhaps the situation are quite similar, we're in the same region, you would have the community helping the people in those refugee camps the best way that they can. But of course, if the population does not have the financing to assist them to the best of their own interest, it's challenging. So I was thinking, and somebody was mentioning diaspora bonds, and in terms of diaspora, how about using diaspora skills? We have in this organization called Afford, African Foundation for Development. They every year they send what they call diaspora resource persons with different skills to do different jobs in Africa. And so these are professionals, diaspora professionals with a certain particular skills, wanting to develop the continent, wanting to bring change to the continent. And so we could use this type of schemes to assist our folks in the communities in the refugee camps. But also, I think that's also perhaps the most important thing to do. And I don't know again how this is done in Kenya, but the refugee camps, as I was saying, are communities of their own. It's very important to map out the skills, because refugees have skills. They have skills that we need to map out, that we need to leverage. And once you do that, once you know who's doing what in those refugee skills, you can also help them develop the community that is being created in those refugee camps. And of course, communication, debates, exchanges between the communities at end and also the refugee camps are also very, very important, because we know sometimes you have some cultural differences between the local communities and the refugees.
We seem to have lost Bora.
You lost me?
Yeah, Bora, we seem to have lost you a little bit there with a slight lag. But your last, I think, 10 to 15 seconds, if you could love to reiterate that before we go into a question from the floor for Cynthia.
Yes, thank you. So I don't know where I was lost, but I would conclude by saying that it's very important for the local communities to be very understanding of the situation in the local camps, and it's very important to map out the skills of the people in the refugee camps, and to leverage those skills to develop not only the refugee camp but also the local communities where they are based. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Bora. Bora, I'm going to add to that before I go into the question with Cynthia. Just again, quick examples to show that we have real examples on our content that are being done in that case. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm singing I feel like I'm speaking as a government spokesperson at this point for the Rwandan government, because live examples that have happened recently with the situation happening in Sudan, the Rwandan government flew in. Has accepted refugees from Sudan. Many of them have really high skills. So we have doctors that are even based out of my workplace here at Norskin. And these doctors have been, some of them are nursing students, some of them are practicing, were already practicing doctors, but majority of them are still going through their education. And they've been tied to hospitals within the country where they're now practicing, right? So this is an African solution for Africans. And then again, teachers are being imported from as far as Zimbabwe, Uganda, other parts of Ghana, where places like Achimota, where we've had situations where they've had strong education systems, and they're being brought into Rwanda to teach in schools in Rwanda, because the country accepted and said, hey, we don't have the best education systems, we don't have people with the most skilled, but then there are Africans out there who are refugees in places but can't provide these skill sets. So why not bring them to our country and let them fill these gaps? And those are already practical solutions. So they're not even being treated in the traditional sense of refugees. No, they're being integrated into the country and communities, and their skill sets are being leveraged to help us achieve Agenda 2063 or help us provide the right digital skills. So let me go to this question, coming in from Isatu Sar, which goes to Cynthia, of how do education policies and regulatory frameworks influence the adoption and implementation of innovative finance and digital solutions in African countries? Cynthia.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Let me just begin with the earlier conversation on refugee camps. Having had the chance to visit the Kakuma refugee camp, what works here in Kenya is Higher Education Loans Board. We've had so many young people accessing higher education because of the Higher Education Loans Board. And if you're not familiar with this, it basically means the government gives you a loan, and then once you get your job, you're able to repay that. So we are asking ourselves, how can these examples be replicated? And especially in the context of refugee camps, I think an alternative is to ask ourselves, okay, we have private sector who want to make money. So how about to replicate the health system into an income sharing agreement? And so you see the private sector will invest in higher education on condition that when these young people are able to access some sort of a job, then they're able to repay it over a period of time. I think it's very important to diversify the health program into an income sharing agreement, and specifically targeting the young people within the refugee camps. Now, on the issue of policy, now wearing my lawyer hat, one of the things that I have experienced is really the issue of tax justice. So we find that a lot of people are being taxed, yet they don't even have a lot of money. And I think I'd mentioned this earlier on. Whereas there are people who have a lot of wealth. We don't even know where this wealth goes, and we're not seeing that money being invested. So then we're asking ourselves, what kind of policy do we need, especially in the context of innovative financing and on the issue of tax justice? I would say we can say that we need to develop a policy whereby these funds that would have otherwise gone missing are channeled into a specific fund that goes into education financing. So one of the results we will see from a policy like this is an increased tax revenue. When we don't see the money disappearing into countries that we've never heard of, then we'll see that money coming into the education financing facility that is especially targeted towards the tax that is unallocated for. And then I would say that when you are saying that you're coming up with this kind of policy, it's very important to ensure that this policy also addresses the tax inequities. And this is where the role of governments and especially international organizations as well can come in. So I know the African Union and the United Nations are working together on a UN tax convention that's supporting global taxes. So we can ensure that wealthy individuals and corporations are contributing their fair share to the national development and especially education. That's innovative finance. And then in this policy framework, when you talk about tax, innovative financing, tax justice, then it's very important to ensure that there's capacity development and regional cooperation. So we can ensure that organizations like tax and education alliances are offering capacity to development to ministries of education, which are in charge of education. Remember, we are not delegating this education responsibility to the private sector. We're not delegating to the civil society. This is ultimately the responsibility of the government. So when you have the capacity development to these people who work in government and regional cooperation, we're going to be able to see these policies creating collaboration within other regions in the global south, beyond Africa. Let's make Africa a very good example. And then another issue on policy and innovative financing, I think it's very important to pick up on what is already working. So for example, we can use debt swaps. For people who don't understand what a debt swap is, in simple terms, it's where a creditor, in this case, maybe a country has given funding to a country like Kenya or Tanzania, and what they do is that they give the condition that they will be forgiven for this, forgiven quote unquote, for this debt on the condition that this local currency is invested in education. So a very good example that can be integrated into policy is, for example, the Global Partnership for Education, which is a very good example, has this program called the Debt to Education Initiative. And we've seen in Cote d'Ivoire, through this particular financing facility, we've seen Cote d'Ivoire has been forgiven, quote unquote, the debt that they had from France. And what they do is they invest that money into education, and specifically public education, because we're talking about children, young people, women who are harder to reach. These are not people who are going to wake up and go into a private school. So if we have policies that integrate debt swaps, then we're going to see more and more people accessing public education because of policies like this that have ensured that the people who are harder to reach are actually targeted. And I think the best reason why I would say this policy would work is in terms of the GPE debt to ed policy, or rather framework. We've seen that overall, because of frameworks like this, between 2000 and 2022, which is just 2 years ago, we've seen 52% to 69% increase in primary education, 35% to 50% lower in secondary education, but we've seen 23% to 33% in upper education. I think when you integrate models like this into your specific policy, and at the end of the day, you're asking yourself, how is this going to impact public education specifically? Of course, the private sector is going to come in and complement, but at the end of the day, how will this work for the children, young people who are harder to reach?
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for that submission. We still want to take another question coming in from the flow, and this question is coming in from again Isa. The question from Isa goes. Sorry, no. Let's take question from Nico. Nico, going to Ray. And this question is, how do we implement the digital transformation if we're not addressing the existing errors in the education in mobilizing young people to speak to the education that they want to receive? Young people need agency. I think urgency. He meant urgency. Young people need urgency when it comes to their future. Ray, that question coming in from Nico.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. And I think I also want to thank Nico for the question. I would have a different opinion or view rather. I think when we say young people are not involved, I think we would need to be very clear in terms of how they are not being included. I think one experience is that there are those young people that are very actively involved in following what's happening around governance and, of course, youth development. These are more likely to know or be involved in various initiatives that would be happening. But also there'll be those young people that are not, because it's not possible that everyone would be participating on every process at the same time. But I think the fundamental question here would be, I wouldn't look at it as whether young people are necessarily all of them involved. But the question would be, would what is happening, or the education aspiration, does it resonate or reflect to the aspiration of the other young people? Because one experience I have learned, and I remember a colleague really mentioned, was that if some young people who have had an opportunity to participate in policy reform processes, and either they're not experts, or they're not well informed, or they're not proactively engaging, they are undermining that representation, because I think they are deemed an opportunity to represent the wider group of young people. But this is not to underscore the role of involvement of young people. So certainly young people are involved. It is very important for them to participate. And so in policy making, so even for us as young people, we have a role of finding out what is happening, of being informed, of educating ourselves. What is happening? This is one thing. It is the other thing that we want to participate, and then we are not given an opportunity to really participate. I think that can be a different thing. And with that case, it's important that we have younger voices and really more aspirations from more, younger generations than it would be for senior citizens, because sometimes senior citizens would want to look into the facts based on the experience that they've had. They may not have a lot of enthusiasm on certain matters. But also the other thing is around engagement in participatory curriculum. And this is where the element of, I think, being involved really comes in. I was very excited in Tanzania. I had learned of an initiative implemented by the government of Tanzania with the United Nations International Labour Organization. This initiative had been called Recognition of Prior Learning. I thought that was fantastic, because this program did is that there's those young people who have had an opportunity to go to formal education, and there are those who have not. So, for instance, I would have born into a family where my father was a carpenter, and then I've been involved in the carpentry for at least 15 years. So if you take a student who had gone into formal education and who have been participating in carpentry in my father's backyard workshop, we have similar, or I might have superior experience and knowledge on carpentry, but I may not speak the same terminologies as their colleague who went to formal education. So this program, really what it did is it was recognizing these people and ranking them to an appropriate level of educational qualification as those who had gone to formal education. So this is also to speak that I think youth are involved in a way, but I think it's difficult to, because it's too many of us. It's over 70% of the population. So sometimes it may be possible that we may not have an opportunity to hear everything that's happening or to be involved in all the policy processes. But certainly, involvement of young people is key, both young people as drivers, but also young people as beneficiaries of these educational policies and, of course, frameworks as well. And so lastly, but not least, is to point out on the need of young people to really develop peer learning platforms. I think I've benefited more from peer learning platforms than I would have from conventional class training, because with peer learning, it had given me more opportunity to find expression, to ask a question where I felt I didn't understand more, and I wouldn't be shy about it. But then when it's in a conventional platform of learning, I think it's been challenging in terms of how I feel like I don't want to be seen as less, smart from across the various colleagues. And so just to really land on this reflection, Mr. Moderator, is that youth participation is key, but also it is possible that we may not be able to participate in all the processes. I think this speaks into how do we as young people share the various synergies that we really collectively have. There's those young people that are more enthusiastic about education, or some people on ICT and technology, some on different things. How would we cultivate this shared experience and shared origin aspiration as young people, so that we understand that together as an ecosystem, I think we present a greatest value in terms of how we inform and influence policy that really benefits the future young people and also ourselves as we proceed. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for our amazing panelists. We're gonna go over and share some insights from the chat to make sure that the voices of the participants from who are joining us online are also heard. Johannes shares with us that he totally agrees that education in Africa needs to be fixed. Many African youth are pursuing fields or majors that are not marketable. Our recent study to better understand employment challenges faced by young graduates in Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa found that over 50% of South African graduates majored in humanities and social sciences, and just 15% into STEM fields. So that kind of relates back to the conversations that we were having about the kind of educational fields that African youth joins. In the same study, only 4% South African youth saw entrepreneurship as a key skill in their field of work. So how do we change this trajectory by mainstreaming entrepreneurship in our educational system? They also mentioned how young people only get into entrepreneurships as a second option if they can't find job, bearing in mind that to be an entrepreneur requires passion, patience. Hence, you see many young entrepreneurs from the region give up so early. And that kind of relates to what we're talking about, how we need to enhance skills when it comes to entrepreneurship, but also empower our youth to take the lead and to be creative and to be innovative with their solutions, which is something that is not necessarily promoted in traditional forms of education. Mr. Jean-Paul Adam also shared with us the proposals for UN tax convention that was also led by African countries. It can be found on the chat. So thank you so much for contributing to the discussion. I'm gonna hand it over to Arnaud if you wanna go ahead.
Thank you, Rania. It's been such an insightful conversation. I want us to go with some call to action in our closing remarks. And I would love to start with Mrs. Ariel Tsamo to give us her closing remarks and potentially a potential call to action as we move forward. I'm not sure if yes, Ariel.
Yes, sorry, my mic was off. So I wanted to ask something that was missing in the conversation about data and e-governance too, because sometimes when you're talking about financing and etc., the problem may be the mismanagement of the allocated resources. For example, in Cameroon, sometimes we say that we have to create 4,000 more teachers, whereas we have enough teachers, but they are misplaced. Sometimes we create schools where the demographic trend is not that urgent. So I think that one key point is also to have e-governance tool that will help government to have real data to help them to take decisions according to what is going on the ground. And it's also going to help in participation, like data and participation of youth, because we can build platform where using USSD or using smartphone, youth can contribute, give their vision, their opinion about the policies that are going to be put in place. So my remark will be with two examples. So the first one is how our tech manufacturing program works. So how we finance it. We had a survey with incubators, with companies, with international companies also, and then we asked them which kind of skills do you need, and then we build a curriculum based on the actual need of these companies, and then at the end we are sure that every batch of students that we have, they have guaranteed job because the need was coming actually from the companies, and then they are giving scholarship for us to create the human capital that they need for their own company. So that is something I think can be replicated. The second point is about financing low tech, like how we can use technology to reduce the investment that we need for have a better education. The second example I will use, for example, that we are doing in Cameroon is 3D printing, for example. We are saying that we need more money to invest to create labs, for example, in schools. Whereas we can use 3D printer, for example, that works with solar panel also, to help a school to autonomously create the resources he needs inside the school. So for me, my last remark will be, yes, the government needs to be intentional, but also we have to think about how we can be disruptive about how we are using technology to make the lowest investment to have the biggest impact for the community.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tamo, for those closing remarks and call to action. I would like to ask Mr. Barrow to give us Mr. Bora Kamwanya to give us his closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure listening to the different inputs from the different colleagues. I think on the continent, it is undeniable that our education system needs financing. We've heard many examples of great initiatives on the continent, and this needs to be shared across the continent. We always talk about Africa as a unit, And when I hear all these different schemes being done in different countries, I'm wondering why we do not see education as a unit as well. Why don't we give, for example, the African Union the competence of education? So financing education is a choice, and it's the right choice, and we need to be more demanding, more bold, and if I may, more aggressive when we're asking for more financing in education, especially in quality education. In the 70s, we had about 185 million children in schools, and our leaders back then saw education as a tool to development. Today, we have 674 million, and seeing the way our demographic is going, financing education is putting people first. If we're not financing education, we are leading ourselves to our doom. Our continent will be following. Our continent will be a continent of consumers. And we do have the capacity, we do have the manpower and woman power. We do have the demographic to be leading this world. We do have the resources to be leading this world. But if we do not have the right education, and if we keep on taking all these people's education, we will be following and following and following. And I do not aspire that for my continent. And I don't think that's the Africa that we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bora Kamwanya, for those closing remarks. I'd love to bring Mrs. Cynthia Nafula into the conversation for her closing remarks. Over to you, Cynthia.
Yes, first of all, a very big thank you to the host of this event, the Office of the UN Special Advisor on Africa. Thank you so much for giving young people like me, young professionals like me, the platform to continue advocating for education and to talk about these important issues. Now, my call to action really will be on accountability, wearing a development partner kind of a shoe, private sector kind of a shoe. And as a lawyer as well, I'm asking for accountability of this funding because we are introducing innovative financing mechanisms. But are we going to be accountable to this? What I would say in terms of my call to action and tying into the issue of policy is to ensure that even as we talk about accountability, we really need to establish a framework of how this accountability can happen. So I would say what would work is a social accountability framework. And one example that I saw was in Ethiopia, where during the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of funding was being given into the communities or to the government to invest in the health sector. And they were using citizens online and the radio and the media to have them talk about any issues of misappropriation of funding. And this enables the community to also participate in accountability mechanisms. The diaspora, people who are buying the bonds that we're talking about, it enables them to express their views and to report on any issues using the media. I think the best way to ensure that a social accountability mechanism like this one works is really to ensure that probably there's debt buy down. Our countries are really struggling with debt. So is it possible then, as a call to action, to have a third party who buys either the interest or the entire debt, and so that we have free funding that can go into social accountability frameworks like this? Even as not also forget the role of the media, and that's where really the issue of social accountability will come in to ensure that it's not just the development partners and the private sector who are following up on accountability communities, as well as ensuring that we are accountable to the funding mechanisms that are already in place or will be established in future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and thank you for making the time to join us for this conversation. Last but not least, Mr. Ray Kiliho from Tanzania, please, if you could share with us your closing remarks.
Thank you so much, moderator. I really want to thank the organizers of this platform for being together. My closing reflections, I would point out on three things, and two of which is part of the key theme. education, I think it's integrate digital literacy into training to allocate resources for these reforms, and not the basics like learning how to turn on a computer off. It's really understanding how technology as a whole can really benefit can be used as a tool for developmental progress. That would be number one. But then number two would be around financing, innovative financing. My colleagues have mentioned various mechanisms of innovative financing. But I just want to, when I hear the things around, illicit financial flows in Africa, I think it's time that Africa should stop playing victim. I think we have the capacity, we have the resources available, we have the will. We just don't have the will. So we have the capacity, we may have the intent, but then the will. So Africa really have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to be intentional and not feel comfortable. I think that will be my closing reflections. Thank you so much for this great opportunity to share. And I really thank everyone for putting it together.
Thank you very much, Ray. Again, I want to thank our panelists that have made this conversation very insightful, starting with Miss Ariel Kitty Otamo, who's the founder and director at KST and Tech Women Factory out of Cameroon. Mr. Bora Kamwanya, Vice President, Diaspora Region for the Pan-African Youth Union, speaking largely from a DRC perspective. Mrs. Cynthia Nafula Nyongesa, advocate for the High Court of Kenya, speaking out of Kenya, of course, and Mr. Ray Kiliho, head of programs, Pan-African Youth Union's Office of the Secretary General, speaking from Tanzania. I want to thank my co-host. I don't know if she has closing remarks before she throws it to Lebo. Rania Harara. She is the founder of Swana Climate Sirens and Gender Equality Advocate and climate experts. Thank you very much. Rania, over to you to throw it to Lebo.
Thank you, Arno. I really appreciated this conversation, and I learned a lot from my fellow activists and fellow advocates and community leaders. Thank you, everyone, for joining the conversation. To our attendees who has been engaging with us in the chat and sharing their insights. I'm gonna hand it over to Lebo for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this crucial conversation on innovative financing and digital revolution in Africa. We're very grateful to our moderators, Rania and Arnold, for driving this dynamic conversation. And a huge thanks to our panelists, Ray, Bora, Cynthia, and Ariel, for your invaluable insights. As our director, John Paul, stated in the beginning, education is one of the best investments that can be made because it is an economic multiplier. So investing in education is actually smart economics for African countries. Africa boasts the world's youngest population, and by 2050, it is estimated that the number of young Africans in between the ages of 15 to 34 are going to increase by 73%. So it is not, because of this population surge, it is not a question of if, but Africa will shape the future. Bora asked, what exactly are we investing in as Africa? Is it that there is no funding, or is it that not enough is being invested in public education? And this poses the question of our priority. And the risk of investing not investing in quality education is that it also results in brain drain of brilliant young Africans to the global north. So, and 6 to 8% of government budget, as he mentioned, should be invested in education. And as young people, we should be questioning how much of our government budgets are actually being invested in education and advocating for more investment in that regard. A solution that Cynthia brought about is diaspora bonds and remittances. As Africans, we know that there are quite a number of Africans living in different countries across the world. So we should be more strategic in finding ways to reinvest those diaspora bonds and remittances into education. She also mentioned the very worrying trend of tax evasions, which is actually robbing children of receiving quality education. And for his part, Ray mentioned that when it comes to education financing, maybe we are looking at education as only a social investment, but not really looking at it as an actual investment that actually brings rewards. And Ariel mentioned that some of the solutions that we could maybe pursue is hybrid technology in areas where there's limited access to internet. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our audiences. I know that Bongekile Filana from South Africa said that community engagement is also key for digital inclusion, and access to internet is something that is a pressing need in Africa. I would like to invite you to join us next week, Thursday, for our third segment of this series. And thank you very much. And join us next week. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and all the best.
Thank you, everyone, for their excellent contributions.
Thank you.